Tonight we welcome Joel Stone, Curator at the Detroit Historical Society, to discuss 300 years of Detroit's history and the story of people whose legacy is traversed by citizens every day. Setting Detroit apart are the recognizable names of streets like Woodward, Beaubien, Mount Elliot, and Selden. Please give a warm RHPL welcome to Joel Stone.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope I can be heard. If not, I can pick this up and make that a little easier. Is that better? Okay. Not bad. It's a big room, and it's full of people, which is wonderful. I always say I'll speak to 2 or 2,000. This is actually a nice blend of that. Street names are one of the things that in Detroit, now let me start, I really should ask this question first. How many people grew up in Southeast Michigan? That helps. How many people grew up in Detroit? Okay, that helps too, because otherwise, if you're from Chicago, this may not be quite as important. Street names are ways that we personalize our town. Every town's got first, second, thirds, fourths. Many towns have oaks and elms, and a lot of towns have Washingtons and Lincolns and things like that. But it's the other streets. It's the streets that are named after some of our founders, some of our rogues, some of our industrialist people who were really involved. I will say that I named this presentation on purpose because most of them are named after dead white guys. If we're talking about the downtown area, those are the guys that are in charge, and if they didn't name them after themselves, they named them after their wives, their father-in-laws, their daughters. So that's why we do have the women too. But it really has only been in recent memory that we have started getting some gender equality when it comes to street names. But we're going back 300 years, 200 years when we're talking about the naming of these things. And let me just see, that's the way to do it. So I always like to start with this just because I'm never sure if people understand entirely our history and where we came from. You know, a city that was a town, a village, a settlement in the woods that was established in 1701. Of course, our history as a human group goes back 10,000 years in this neighborhood, certainly regular human habitation 1,000 years. And we do have the bones of that habitation going back that far, but it's really that the establishment of streets is relatively new, only about 300 years old. We were a stockaded town for a long time, right up through about 1820, and then because of the way we were built, we were highly dependent on the river. We've got an exhibit at the Dawson Great Lakes Museum called Built by the River, because the river certainly helped build Detroit, but we built along the river for many, many years. We were built right along the river there. Center for distinctive regional development in many, many ways, innovation, industrial innovation, many things there. Streets with a reach, establishing a baseline. I thought for a very long time that baseline, 8 Mile Road. You can call it what you wish. It was drawn across the state, and then there was another line drawn up the middle of the state to kind of establish a place for the surveyors to lay out Michigan, the counties, the towns, and eventually the streets. If you follow 8 Mile across or baseline, it does not go perfectly from one side to the other, besides the fact that lakes get in the way. There's a place about halfway across the state where it jogs north about a half mile. So it's not perfectly straight across. And I thought for a long time that it also created the line between Wisconsin and Illinois, which may have been true in the minds of the surveyors, but today when we look at a map, the line between Wisconsin and Illinois is about 4 miles north of where our 8 Mile Road sits. So we do have streets with a reach, starting right here in Detroit. We started naming towns pretty early on. Cadillac came here 1701 to establish his little fortress, his little fiefdom, his little. I think he thought of it as his own little country. He was meant to simply be the governor, but he thought of himself as the king, and it laid out the town. not so very popular with many of the people here, not so very popular with his bosses back in Quebec, back in Montreal, back in France. So he didn't last long. He was only here till about 1710, but long enough to establish Detroit as a stockaded town like this. Today, that area would sit right about where the Lodge Freeway ducks down under Cobo Hall, so in front of what used to be the Pontchartrain Hotel, or in front of the Veterans Memorial Building, which is the UAW Training Center now. But that's about where it was. And if you look back at this picture, his town sat right on the river. And it's over time that we have filled in that waterfront enough between the burning of the town in 1805 and very, all the dirt that had to come out from under all of those skyscrapers to put in the basements. We have pushed the limits of the river quite a bit out from there. This kind of shows you the town that he would have identified with and some of the names that he would have put on. If I close in on that scene, you're going to see some of the names that he had. St. Honoré, of course, he named the main street St. Anne's. That was the day that they landed here, and it became the Feast of St. Anne's. He named the chapel that came soon after that St. Anne's, and that essentially sits where Jefferson is today. Of course, this was a small street, probably 20 feet wide, didn't have sidewalks, and there was another street, St. Louis. Of course, Louis was the king. If you want to stay in your position, you name a street after the king. Always a good idea. And then some of the other ones that just came up, perhaps family members, perhaps patron saints. We do know that St. Antoine was a property owned by Antoine Beaubien. And so on one side of his farm was St. Antoine, his patron saint, and on the other side was Beaubien. So you can outline where he was. And that also kind of gives an idea of the origins, some of the origins of the street names that are still with us. Now, it wasn't long after that the British came through. 1760, they took over the town, and at that point, they were in the minority. They had a small garrison. They had some administrators who came in, and essentially they took the town that he left them, and they anglicized the names. They didn't change much. But out of this period, we did get a couple of streets that are still with us today. During the Revolutionary War, the British were worried about the Americans coming north out of Ohio country after Detroit, and they built up kind of on a rise above the town. They built a four-sided star fort, which was originally named Fort Lerneau after the engineer who built it. But after the War of 1812, it was named for the governor of Kentucky, who had sent troops up to Detroit to help take the city back from the British. Of course, the British took the town from us during the War of 1812 for almost a year, and it was the troops that came out of Ohio, Lewis Cass being among them, troops that came out of Kentucky that helped get the city back. So they renamed the fort Fort Shelby, and if you're walking around downtown Detroit and you want to know where that is, you stand at the corner of Fort and Shelby Street, and you're going to be right there. I think there's still a big plaque on the side of one of the buildings that'll tell you that if you forget. I mentioned the city burning down in 1805, one of several major conflagrations, but this was a first-class one. It burnt the entire village, save for a stone storehouse and an outhouse. The outhouses were along the river bank. Remember, there was a big bank that dropped down there. It was very propitious, but didn't burn the outhouse, didn't burn one of the storehouses. Everything else went. The fort was not touched, which was fortunate, and most of the people who lived in the area lived outside of town. This was a Sunday morning. There wasn't much of a breeze, which I think was very fortunate. Most of the people were available to get their goods and belongings out of the house. Nobody died. There were a couple of injuries, minor injuries, but it worked both in our favor and against us. Against us, we completely lost that old world flavor that you'll get if you're wandering down a street in old France or in Ireland, where the streets are very close together, the sidewalks are right up against the houses. We would have had that. In fact, if you go to Amherstburg, which at the time when they founded it was called Malden, and the fort was called Amherstburg. They've kind of switched those up now. But if you go down to Amherstburg on the south end of the Detroit River, there are places right around the fort there that have that closeness of the kind of an old European town. With this fire, we lost that, which I kind of regret. But a good thing came out of that, in that we were able to reestablish the plan of the city based on a more modern idea. And I'll discuss that in a second, but it gave us the opportunity to have a city center that we could eventually grow into. In other words, the streets were no longer 20 feet wide with a 2-foot sidewalk on either side, notorious for having horse races down the middle. You better get out of the way pretty quick. We were able to put in avenues that were 200 feet wide, regular streets that were 60, 80, and 100 feet wide that allowed for the growth that we were eventually able to have. Detroit's bones. I talk about the bones that we live with today, and this is really important when we discuss this. There were, before Europeans arrived, the bones of what we have today. These were basically Indian trails, and I say basically because somebody called me on it. The trail didn't run directly down the middle of what's now Michigan Avenue. It probably wandered around, and the surveyors found the best spot for it. But these trails were well established by the time Europeans got here. The Miami Trail leading down to where the Miami tribe lived down along the Maumee, what's now Toledo. The Sauk Trail, which led over toward the base of Lake Michigan. The Fort St. Joseph Trail, an old British fort at the base of Lake Huron. The River Trail, having a trail along the river. You notice it kind of diverges from the river there. That was the Grand Marais, the big swamp. It had to kind of go around the swamp that it became very expensive housing afterwards. The Pontiac Trail that headed up toward what is today Pontiac, but really headed all the way to Mackinac. I was looking at a map from 1864 the other day, and there's a trail on there. We're just barely getting railroads and very few people north of Pontiac. Saginaw, and there is a trail that runs all the way up to Mackinac and pretty much runs right along where I-75 is today. There's a trail that meets it, much as 127 would go up and meet 75. Those things have been with us for a long time. They were well established, and these things didn't change. Well, they did change. We changed the names on them. Okay, we got people in here. We named them after famous politicians. We named them after, well, the Grand River, of course, after a river, but the Chicago Road, Fort Street, we talked about that. So these are with us. Other bones that we've got, and it's not showing up on my screen yet, it's better up there. These are the old French ribbon farms. And the French had a great way of doing farms in the new frontier. They did it over in Quebec, they did it here, whereby because the water was your highway, everybody got a piece of the water. So it was very thin farms, basically a block wide. Think of St. Antoine and St. Antoine and Beaubien, basically a block wide. And then they'd go back for 3 miles. And on that, you'd have everything you needed. You had water for your ministrations and for eating and cooking, for travel. You had lumber that you needed for building, lumber you needed for your firewood. Game was running through the creeks and things that ran through there. The creeks also had the furs that you trapped. So in one farm, you could have just about everything you needed in addition to security, because the farmhouses were invariably right along either the river or the lake, and your neighbor was just a block away. I've got a cousin who lives out in Nebraska, big corn farmer, corn and cattle, and his next neighbor is 4 miles away in the way we built farms out there. These farms allowed you on the frontier to have people right next to you, which in the case of the French, who liked to party a lot, was a really good thing, because during the long cold winters you were able to get together with friends, race ponies on the ice, do whatever you needed to do, but you had the security of proximity, and you had the socialization that they needed out there. Now, many of these street names still exist. You think Livernois. Livernois was named after the farmer that owned it. And if you go drive Livernois, you start down at historic Fort Wayne, right on the river, and you drive Livernois, it's going to go off on an angle. Now, this map is kind of twisted. The north is up to the upper right. You drive up Livernois for 3 miles. All of a sudden, you get to modern Livernois. It takes a hard right. Whoops. It takes a hard right and then goes dead north. So that you'll be able to see that. If you were on Van Dyke, you do the same thing. You take Van Dyke 3 miles from the river, and it's going off at kind of a northwesterly direction. You get to the end of that 3 miles, and it cocks dead north. So many of the bones that we've got are based on these old ribbon farms, as well as the names. And of course, the names downtown, Beaubien, Riopelle, Rivard, St. Aubin, these are all familiar family names from the very early period in Detroit. If you get up into Grosse Pointe, Vernier, the Moros are all names that came from the ribbon farms that we have. So before we even start going into the British Europeans, we've got some of the bones that the Native Americans left us and the bones that the French left us after their 100 years of really being in the majority. So following the fire, there were 2 ideas. Governor Hull and Augustus Woodward, who was the Justice of the Supreme Court, kind of were at odds over just about everything. But when it came to the laying out the street, Hull's idea was lay it down, get these people back into homes and properties, they can build their businesses up and get Detroit back on its feet quick. Okay? Woodward came from a different angle. Woodward had been, we would call it part of the Enlightenment. And Woodward was a disciple of Thomas Jefferson. He really enjoyed what was going on in France as far as the Enlightenment, and supposedly he had a diary. Nobody's ever found it, but it's been written. I think Silas Farmer wrote that Woodward carried around a diary that had L'Enfant's plan for Washington, D.C. in it, which includes kind of these cross sections, these roads that go at odd angles. And Woodward simply took the idea and simplified it, made it into hexagons that, you know, could be replicated ad infinitum, one after another, as far as the city just wanted to keep growing, keep extending the hexagons. Curiously, they pretty much match up with the spokes that we have coming out of them. In other words, Gratiot goes off at one angle on a hexagon, Michigan Avenue off on another. A street that he called Woodward, claimed he didn't name it after himself. The road ran toward the woods, right? I don't think they believed him then, and I don't think we believe him now. But it pretty much matched this up, and down there kind of in the lower center is a square area that he called Campus Martius. And this would be translated to Mars, a field of Mars, the god of war. This would be a place where troops could congregate if they needed to drill. That was kind of his center of town. And Campus Martius really has remained the center of Detroit for many, many years. Woodward was not very popular because he was rather eccentric, and I can touch on that later, but he pretty much got overruled. The people who lived here wanted Hull's plan to survive. They wanted the city built quickly. They wanted it built on a square plan so they could get on with their life. You can kind of see the stockade here goes off at that odd obtuse angle to the upper left. That essentially is Michigan Avenue. Woodward runs up the center. The fort, this is about 1820. The fort will go away in 1826. We no longer are angry with the British. We get angry with them back in the 1830s and built Fort Wayne. But at this point, we're ready to get rid of it, and the city's ready to have it gone. So that gets pulled down, much of the dirt dumped into the waterfront. They both clean it up and fill it in. And we start getting some recognizable streets. Streets that everybody has, the Jeffersons, Washingtons, Madisons, Adams, you know, all of the towns were putting in those street names at the time, but we also start getting some of the more particular ones, particularly Detroit: Woodward, Macomb, Woodbridge, Atwater, Miami, and Campus Martius. I mentioned Augustus Woodward. This is a picture that was drawn, painted by a Grosse Pointe artist, Maniscalco, for the Michigan Supreme Court. If you go up there, they've got a gallery full of all of the Supreme Court justices. Woodward was our first one. We really don't know what he looked like. The only other picture that exists has an even bigger proboscis on him. He was evidently very eccentric. He would get up in the middle of a case and go down to the river and dangle his feet in the water and think about it or fall asleep or whatever. He was often accused of being drunk on the bench, smelling of alcohol. Having studied taverns in early Detroit, everybody drank in early Detroit. Nobody trusted the water. So even people who weren't drinkers would put a couple of drops of something in the water to purify it. So you can hold against him what you wish, but he was also one of the guys who helped get the University of Michigan started. He came up with a really, really crazy name for it, the Cathalopamistiad. Yeah, I don't know either. And it wasn't biology and history and physics. It was a bunch of things he invented. Very, very creative man. Nobody in Detroit could put up with him. They finally got him transferred to another judgeship in Florida in 1823. He left. I think he died in 24. And there's very little record of the man, which is really too bad, seeing as he's got his name on our main street. The McComb family, we've kind of changed their name, but back then they were very Scott, came in as provisors for the British Army and then became sutlers for the American Army, made a lot of money, bought a lot of real estate. At one time they owned Groseal and Belle Isle and a lot of outlying property. Alexander left for New York and got into New York real estate. His son went on to become the head of the U.S. Army after winning a wonderful battle at the Battle of Plattsburgh. So very famous there. The other brother, William, stayed in Detroit and did very well by that. And because of this family, we have not only Macomb Street, well, we actually don't have that anymore, but we do have Macomb County and other roads that are named for them. We changed the name back in the early 20th century to Bagley, after John Bagley, who had been very, very good to the city of Detroit. He had been a tobacco merchant, got into the life insurance business, became a banker, again helped establish the University of Michigan, the Board of Education, involved in the Common Council, police commissioner, back before we really had a police department. So he was really involved in that. In his will, he left us the Bagley Fountain, which still exists down in Cadillac Square. So people really wanted to honor him. They changed, because we now had Macomb County, they changed the street called Macomb to Bagley Street. Woodbridge, and I think William Woodbridge was actually a happier looking guy than this. Again, like many of the people of this period, coming from the East, coming from Connecticut, from Rhode Island, from Massachusetts, New York, generally known as Yankee Yorkers, and a lot of the people we'll mention here came that way. Came here, served as an assistant to Governor Cass. Lewis Cass, very driven as far as his political career, was often out of town in Washington or on the East Coast trying to chase up money for the city and for the state. And while he was gone, Woodbridge really ran quite a few things. They ended up getting a street right down near the river named after him. Reuben Atwater, I've never been able to find a picture of Reuben Atwater, and as far as I can tell, his name was spelled with 3 T's, not 2. I always assumed Atwater was named Atwater because it was at the water. You'd think it was natural, and maybe it was, which is why they named it there. But he came here as a secretary to the state, and again was serving as acting governor when Cass was off and gone, under Hull, and became collector of customs, which is a really pretty cushy job back then, and died in 1831. One of the things you'll note as we go through this, that if you want a street named after you, dying is a pretty good way to do it. So he died at a time we were looking to name some of our newer streets. Miami Street, unfortunately, is no longer with us. We've recalled it Broadway, which is really too bad because everybody's got a Broadway. But the Miami Street was named after the band of Native Americans who lived to the south of us down in what's now the Toledo area, and were considered he and Red Jacket were very, very involved in Native American pushback against the Americans. They supported the British. Of course, the Native Americans didn't like the British when they first arrived, but they didn't like the Americans even more. And so that they were allied with the British up until the Battle of Fallen Timbers, when Anthony Wayne was able to defeat them. And once they were defeated, he was one of the guys that said, all right, we really need to lay down our arms, get along with these Americans, because they're the guys who are going to be here for a while. He was well respected in the literature. You'll hear about him. He ended up touring the East Coast. He met George Washington. He was feted in New York. Became really fairly famous as a Native American, kind of along the Joseph Brant line. And when they were busy naming streets, they didn't name it after him, but they did name it after his band of Native Americans. And I thought that was nice. It's too bad we haven't kind of changed that name back. I mentioned Campus Martius, and really it has been the center of Detroit for a long time. Our city halls have been there. This picture, did I put in a bigger one? Yeah, this is a picture of the day after Lincoln had been shot. And of course, the word came in by telegraph, and there was kind of an impromptu memorial service right there on Campus Martius. You can see in the background the flag furthest in the distance is flying from the high school, which at one time was our state capital. So Campus Martius really was the center of town, and if you've been downtown, it's still the center of town today. So now we move on. The plan that Woodward wanted kind of got boiled down, and it became a mash of the two between Hull and Woodward. You can see that the streets to the south have become kind of just the standard squares. They did keep kind of that octagonal look up to the north. Back at the time, you had to get street plans approved by Congress, which is kind of crazy. But we did, and this is where we also start to see other street plans coming in. I will make one comment. I'm kind of glad that Woodward's plan didn't come to pass. Can you imagine trying to give somebody directions in a town full of octagons and alleys? It would have been really tough. So we start getting names of people that we recognize and are very common today. Lewis Cass, of course, came up with one of the Ohio Brigades during the War of 1812. He was involved in the surrender of the city by Hull. In fact, it was taking his troops toward Detroit when he heard cannon fire, turned around and took his troops away from Detroit, did not support Hull at the time. And once the city fell, he was very, very adamant that that was a bad move. And he and General Dearborn, who Fort Dearborn, now Chicago, was named for, was very active in this area, were very, very instrumental in getting Hull court-martialed. And getting Hull sentenced to death. It was actually commuted, so he wasn't, but it broke. Hull had been a Revolutionary War hero, and Lewis Cass made a point of destroying his reputation over that incident. Didn't stop him. He went on to absolute fame as not only the governor of Michigan, but he went on to be the Secretary of War, the Secretary of State under Buchanan. He ended up stepping down from that position because he didn't agree with Buchanan's take on the coming American Civil War. He did get to be ambassador to France for a while. So Cass had a very, very illustrious career and became really quite a hero. So the street that is named Cass was a farm that he bought from a French family and eventually sold parts of it off right before the crash of 1837. The guys he sold it to, Woodbridge, Trowbridge, some of those guys, all defaulted on his sale. So he got his property back, and he turned around and resold it to him later on. Oddly enough, Cass is also one of those bones of Detroit that you'll see down at the riverfront. Cass Avenue is 4 blocks from Woodward Avenue. When you get up to the Detroit Historical Museum, 3 miles later, it is just 1 block because the Cass farm sat on a line that was different than the one that Woodward established as that main street. So the Cass Avenue is really one of the throwbacks to the ribbon farm era. Elijah Brush, unfortunate. Elijah Brush had come back from the War of 1812 and died very, very soon afterwards. He would have been one of those people we would have loved to have had around here. He ended up, before he died, marrying the daughter of John Askin, Julia Askin. John Askin was probably one of the wealthiest guys in Detroit, fur salesman, but he was also British. And after the Jay Treaty that gave Detroit to the United States, he stuck around for a little while, sat as a trustee on the city council, but then he moved across to Windsor, or Sandwich, built himself a house he named after his boyhood home in Northern Ireland called Strabane, and Askin left, and he sold his farm to Elijah Brush. We have no street named after John Askin, which is really too bad because he was a pretty important guy. Elijah Brush, a real nice guy, but he got the street named after him after he died. Frederick Bates. Bates Street, you may not even notice Bates Street. Bates Street used to run right next to Ford Auditorium. And Bates had come in, again, as a justice on the Supreme Court here in Detroit. He didn't really like living here, as far as I can tell, everything I've read. He didn't like Woodward at all, but then nobody did. So he got up and he left pretty quickly and ended up becoming governor of Missouri. But while he was here, they were able to name that street after him, the one right to the east of Woodward Avenue. And I guess personally, as he didn't like Detroit, Detroit has slowly not liked him, and bits of Bates Street have disappeared. So where the Coleman A. Young Municipal Center, the city-county building, Bates Street would have run right through that. And the building right next to it, Bates Street would have run right under what is now a parking garage. And right across from that, there's another building that got built over Bates Street. So Bates Street has gone from being about 6 or 8 blocks long to being about 3 blocks long. And I'm okay with that. Silas Farmer. Anybody that walked out the back of Hudson's would have seen the signs that said Farmer Street. And it wasn't actually named after Silas Farmer. It was named after his dad, who was a cartographer and a printer and was involved in putting all the names on the maps of the streets. So he named one after himself or got somebody to do it for him. But I mentioned Silas, the son, because Silas, being involved in the cartography, being involved in the printing business in Detroit, became really our first historiographer. Okay, and really kept the history up, and if you're interested, it's online. They may have a copy here. Silas Farmer wrote 2 books, each one about that thick. Came out in the 1880s, I think, right in that, 1884. And my favorite title, History of Detroit and Michigan, or Metropolis Illustrated, a chronological cyclopedia of the past and present, including a full record of territorial days in Michigan and the annals of Wayne County. Not short for words. Part of Silas Farmer's book includes a chapter called Street Names. Much of what I've got here is taken from Silas Farmer's book. Much of what you will find if you go on the internet is taken directly from Silas Farmer's book. In fact, there was a book published back, I think, in the late 60s by a local writer, and she used mostly all the information in the book comes directly out of Farmer. So much of what we've got goes right back to Silas Farmer, and I don't always agree with him, and I'll point those out as we go forward. But I'll also tell you, I haven't had the time to really figure out that he's absolutely wrong. Randolph Street is a perfect example. John Randolph, Virginia native, never visited Detroit, eccentric, wealthy tobacco merchant. I love the quote, "I'm an aristocrat, I love liberty, I hate equality." That's my kind of guy. He did, when he finally was getting toward the end of his life, manumitted all of his slaves and bought them property in Ohio. So not a bad guy. Made famous by a poem. I'm not sure that's exactly why we would name a street after Randolph, unless he also was a friend of Woodward's. And I've not been able to prove that one way or another. So that's a big question mark in my head. Marquis de Lafayette, Lafayette, this guy was a hero following the War of Revolution, American independence, and I'm not surprised that there are Lafayette streets throughout. Lafayette used to be both sides of Woodward. They really have gotten rid of most of it over in the Lafayette Park area. Ironically, Lafayette went away. They named the park after him, but the street disappeared. Charles Larned, also a real neat guy, a lawyer in town, argued before Woodward. Anybody interested in the early slavery in Detroit, he argued both of the cases, both in front of Woodward, that freed up one family and left another enslaved. It had to do with the way the borders were in the laws, the British laws in Canada and our laws here. But was a pretty neat guy, you know, involved in the War of 1812. Survived the first cholera epidemic in 1832, but did not survive the second one, so he died. And they named a street after him. Here's another one I disagree with Farmer on. Roger Griswold, this is according to Farmer, named by Governor Woodbridge in honor of his friend, the Federalist governor in Connecticut. Relatively logical. Woodbridge named a lot of streets after friends and family. So this pretty much makes sense, but there was a guy named Stanley Griswold who lived here and was a pastor, a newspaperman, involved as a secretary of the Michigan Territory, so a politician, eventually moved to Ohio and became a fairly important guy, and shows up in the literature a fair amount. So I would be really surprised if Griswold was not named for Stanley as opposed to Roger. This one would be one I'm slowly getting to the bottom of. Hopefully in a year or two I might be able to answer this question. Mad Anthony Wayne, this one's pretty easy. This is the guy who came in and got Detroit from the British. After the Revolutionary War, the British refused to leave. They figured our little experiment in American government would fail. And why move all those troops out of Detroit? We'll just leave them in place. And Wayne came up. There were 3 different expeditions that tried to get the British out of Detroit. Harmer's and St. Clair's were both disasters, absolute disasters. Anthony Wayne came up, another Virginian, came out of Virginia, came up here, made it happen, came to Detroit, you know, big parades, fed it all over the place, got on a boat and headed back to the East Coast. He got as far as Erie, Pennsylvania, where he died. And then we named a bunch of stuff after him. So Wayne Avenue, much of Wayne Avenue is no longer known as that. It's Washington Boulevard now goes all the way down to the river. Washington Boulevard used to be just that part from Grand Circus Park down to Michigan, and then it was Wayne Street, and that has disappeared, but he's okay with it. He's got a county named after him. Charles Gratiot. Neat guy. He came in. He was an American engineer. He was assigned to taking the fort that was up at the base of Lake Huron, what's now Port Huron, and turning that into a viable fort. It had been Fort St. Joseph. It was called, I think, Fort, started with an M, something after that. And then he went up there, and they ended up calling it Fort Gratiot. Much like Fort Larneux was named after its engineer, Fort Gratiot was named for Charles Gratiot. And it was only logical that the street that ran between Detroit and Port Huron, or Fort Gratiot, would be named Gratiot Avenue. So that pretty much made sense. Cadillac, and there's a lot of opinions on Cadillac. Cadillac came here, I mentioned earlier, really trying to establish his own colony. Set himself up as governor, got approved by the king, charged way too much in rent. Snuck furs back into France under the king's nose, didn't make him very popular, got promoted to governor of Louisiana, which was like being promoted to governor of Siberia. He didn't like that, didn't last very long. He lost all the money he'd invested in Detroit, didn't invest in Louisiana, went back to France, spent a few years in jail, and eventually bought himself a seniorship and became mayor of a small town where he died. There was a time about 100 years ago when the Detroit Historical Society, some folks at the Burton Collection, really researched this, started collecting his letters, getting the information about him, developing a story that really placed him up on a pedestal that he deserved part of. Really, he was an inventive man, a very daring man, and coming out and establishing a fort in this area on the frontier was pretty bold. I'll give him a lot of credit for that. Was he the nicest guy? Not at all. but we forgot about that for a while and named a bunch of stuff after him besides a car. So he's got Cadillac Square, which is right next to Campus Martius. He got Cadillac Boulevard, which one time was one of the fancier streets on the east side. There is a Cadillac Street up on the near west side, and there is a Lemouth Street, which was one of the things he did was invent his royalty and invent his last name. So Lemouth Street is his adopted family kind of royal name. And we've got a street just off of Woodward named for that. So we've given him his due, and we probably won't give it back. What's that? And several dealerships. Lots, they're just all over the place. Yep. So how did we get Detroit's mile roads? If you start at the river and drive straight up Woodward, it's going to take you about 9 miles to get to 8 Mile Road. So how did this happen? The first part is it didn't start at the river. It started from the center of Campus Martius, the center of town. The Soldiers and Sailors Monument had a benchmark there that was the start of our mile road system. Now they've moved the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, so the benchmark doesn't count anymore. But then if you draw a line straight north from that, you get your 8 miles. And we've pretty much named most of them. Now, over on the east side, this doesn't happen, but if you're driving up the west side, if you're heading up Telegraph, you're going to start at basically Ford Road, and you're going to cut your way up past Warren and Joy and Plymouth and Schoolcraft and Fenkell and McNichols, and 7 Mile. Naming opportunities, all right? I don't think, does anybody got a name for 7 Mile besides 7 Mile? Seymour? Where? Is 6? Okay, well now see, this is the problem with doing these talks. I always having to go look some stuff up. But I'm going to go look Seymour up and see. To my knowledge, 7 Mile is 7 Mile Road. So if you got a couple of $1 million, the city I'm sure would be happy to name the street after you. Is what? Well, Moross really isn't. That's 8. Vernier would be 7 Mile. Moross would be 8. No, the other way around. You're right. You're right. But if you follow it over and you get as far as Kelly, no, a little south of Kelly, so it must be about 94, it turns. And if you're talking Vernier, it's the same thing. There's Old 8 Mile Road, and Vernier kind of cuts down at an angle. So it's close, but it's not quite. But that's a good bet. I'm gonna keep that. 7 Mile, we're still looking. Any bets? Any bids? Nope. State Fair is 7.5. So, okay. I'm always happy to take input. My email address is on DetroitHistorical.org. You can feel free to send me something if you find it. Anyway, so who were these guys? Well, Henry Ford, I don't think we need to do. Let's start at the top and go down. John McNichols, a priest who was the guy responsible for moving the University of Detroit from their downtown campus right there on Jefferson Avenue. They bought property out at 6 Mile in Livernois, and soon after that he died. And then they named a street after him the next year. I'm just saying. It was a good thing to do. It was a nice thing. He really kind of helped establish that whole university district up there. As an offshoot, we've got Fenkell and Oakman. People ask about these, and this is kind of an example of how streets got their names. Very early on, mayors would name them, or people who sat on as a trustee on the council would name them. A little bit later, it had to go through a bit more of a process through city council, but it wasn't always recorded. After that, if you were on the water board, especially if you were on the Department of Parks and Boulevards, that was a good way to get your in a spot where you were able to do names. Being part of the government was a good part of this, and both George Fenkell and Robert Oakman were part of the water board back in the early 1920s. And think about the 1920s. Well, actually, you won't have to because I'll explain it in just a second. But that's how those guys were able to do it. Henry Rowe Schoolcraft, we know his story very well, an ethnic ethnologist, a geologist, historian, did a lot with Native American, capturing them before their tribes disappeared. What didn't spend a lot of time in Detroit, but was a real hero in Michigan. James Joy, pretty much the same thing. He did spend a lot of time in Michigan, made a lot of money running railroads, starting with the Michigan Central Railroad and later railroads out to the west in Iowa and Illinois, and was really very, very good at that. Spent some time on the state legislature. So he was an important guy. His son went on to bring Packard to Detroit from Warren, Ohio. So having the Joy name out there is probably a real good thing. Another disagreement I have with Farmer, he says that Warren was named after Joseph Warren, who actually died at the Battle of Bunker Hill. So well earlier than this, was feted as a hero, did visit Detroit. He came in with Braddock way back in '64 when the British had first just taken over. But I think there's probably a farmer's name, somebody out in that area, and I haven't answered that question yet. Looking into it, Ford Road, I think we know where that came from. So, what's that? Oh, Davidson was a farmer. Actually, I did find that, which is why I think Warren is the same way. If you go back to the old atlases, there was a great atlas they put out in 1876 at the Centennial, and you can see John Davidson's name is on the atlas at the area where the street came through. So thanks for asking that. So this is kind of how we grew up till statehood. We started with that little white patch in the center, which was essentially the beginning of town. The yellow, green up the middle there is an area that was given to us by Congress called the Governor and Judges plots. In fact, where the Detroit Historical Museum sits, if we go back and look at the deed for my museum, it's going to say Governor and Judges plots. This was land that was given to us to sell to help pay the bills for early Detroit. After that, these are basically ribbon farms that were bought over time. The one in the middle there that was not bought was Nags. The Nags family didn't get along at all with, certainly not with Woodward. They got into a public fist fight, and Woodward sued him, and I think the jury gave him a penny. I think they figured he deserved it. But the Nags family eventually did sell the property to the city. So then after statehood, we started growing a little bit more, just a little. This is up through the end of the American Civil War. So we've grown a little bit to the east. Again, we're building along the river, built by the river. Then we go up to 1900. We stretch a little bit north, east and west. You can recognize kind of the outline of the green there would be Grand Boulevard. You know, which was one of our parks. That was one of our big fancy parks that ran all the way around the city. To the north, the yellow there is what would be Boston Edison District. And then to the east, over by Belle Isle, there was old Hamtramck Township. So that's about as far as we got by 1900. Okay? Watch what happens in the next 27 years. Okay, that's up through the end of World War I. Everybody comes home and keeps on building. Car business takes off. Everybody wants a nice big yard and a new home. And this is really when Detroit was booming. The 1920s was huge. The number down in the corner should say 1927 instead of 1925. But this is really where we went to our 138 square miles. In that last period, they were naming streets after anything. I'm sure they were going out and pulling the atlases, the encyclopedias down. They're named after foreign cities, foreign rulers, foreign countries, foreign rivers. There's all of them are out there. If you go or drive around the city, you're going to find just about every kind of flower, every kind of tree, every kind of physical landmark. They're going to be out there. Famous people in the country, famous people in the world. It was growing so fast, they just started dropping names on them without a lot of rhyme or reason. Nevada's over on the east side of town. Iowa's over on the west side of town. They just were popping them in as quickly as possible. So getting Oakman and Finkel in there, that was probably really easy for those guys at that point. So then we also had the freeways. Starting in the 60s, we started putting in the freeways. The first one being what's now I-94, the Detroit Industrial Freeway, which if you look at a map, it's still going to say the Detroit Industrial Freeway, getting people out of Detroit to Willow Run to build bombers. And that eventually, because Edsel Ford died young, that was, again, died. That got a street named after him. And then we started John Lodge. Well, let's see, I think we've got him here. John Lodge was a mayor who died soon after this. Walter Chrysler, again, namesake. Oddly enough, Walter never really lived in Detroit. He had an apartment here, but his home was in Long Island. But pretty important guy here, so we named a street after him. Fisher Brothers, hugely involved in the city. They were not only wealthy, but they were philanthropists. They did a lot of really good stuff for people in Detroit, and so having their name remembered is a wonderful thing. Walter Reuther, 696. Can you name the date it opened and the day he died? They pretty much line up. So that's another one of those cases. Ed Jeffries was the guy who really got the highway system going, not the main highway system, but our freeway system got started with 375, and it was a mayor during the period that they were starting this work, so getting that named after him. And then just a few years ago, they named part of what we all call the Jeffries Freeway. The part in Detroit was renamed for Rosa Parks, so we finally got a woman the name on one of these streets. Everybody wants to know John R. Street. How did that come in? Well, John R. Williams was the nephew of Joseph Campo. His father was a very well-to-do, Thomas Williams was a very well-to-do dry goods merchant in town. John R. did very well by himself, was involved in a lot of the development of early Detroit fire departments and things like that. So he got, when he was mayor, named John R. Street, and the street right next to it, Williams. And then he also named one for his wife and one for his daughter. So good idea there. Mr. Elliot, Robert Elliot. Of course, Mount Elliot and Elmwood Cemetery right next to each other. One is the Protestant cemetery, one is the Catholic cemetery. They were out on, that was at the very edge of town at the time they built that. The streetcar line stopped prior to that, so that was really the edge of town. They finally opened the cemetery. Mr. Elliot was the first one to die, and so that they named the cemetery after him as the first one interred, and they named the street that it sits on for him. Harper, this is a story I probably don't have time to go into. It's a wonderful story. Walter Harper and Ann Martin came from Philadelphia, the two of them. Harper being a huge investor in real estate, Greenfield Township. He owned large tracts of Greenfield Township. He also owned property down closer to Detroit, big pieces of property in Philadelphia. We're not sure how his first wife died, and we're not sure how his second wife died. But after the second wife died, he took up with his housekeeper, Ann Martin. Everyone knew her as Nancy. No, really, they did. He became kind of a hermit and really kind of withdrew. His children from the first marriage completely disowned him, and he really kind of withdrew into a home that Nancy kept. She was the housekeeper, but if you look in the directories, she's the one that's keeping the house. She was crazy. She was a loud, obnoxious, vociferous Irish woman, pugilistic, arguably. Most of the times we see her in the record, it's because she's been arrested for being drunk. But she also had a very, very successful business selling fowl, quails and pheasants and that kind of thing, to wealthy Detroiters who would come to her stall. And the market at that point, Central Market, was right behind City Hall. So all of the movers and shakers in City Hall would come there. All of the wealthy people who were looking for her product would come there. She'd sit down and play euchre with them, sometimes go out and get drunk with them. Invariably, Sunday morning, she's dressed in her widow's black. She had been twice widowed. She was at Fort Street Presbyterian Church every Sunday without blinking, but kind of the complete opposite. And yet the two of them stayed together for the rest of their lives. During the Civil War, some of the churchgoers, there had been in a Catholic hospital, and some of the Protestant clergy said, we need to have a Protestant hospital. And so they went to the government, because it was during the Civil War, and said, can you give us the money to build the hospital? We will find the money to endow it and the property to build it on. And Reverend Duffield went to Walter Harper, and he donated all of his property for the endowment for Harper Hospital, and then turned around, probably in the same breath, to ask Ann Martin if he could have her property that sat on Woodward Avenue, ironically, at Harper Avenue. And she did. She donated. She had made enough money selling squab that she was able to donate all of that property, with the caveat that they built her a cottage that the two of them could live in. And he died soon after that. She then moved into the hospital and died at the hospital. But he got the street named after him. She got a little tiny lane that used to come off the front of Harper Hospital called Martin Place. In fact, in the last slide, my first slide, you could see Martin Place. And unfortunately, I mean, it would have come right out into the front door of Orchestra Hall if it still existed. It doesn't exist anymore. It's a parking lot and a building. So unfortunately, the girl who actually earned the name has lost that street. So there are some ladies, mostly the wives and daughters of people who were able to be in a position to put their names on the street. So there are ladies' names all over town. Most of them were not the people who had their finger on the pulse. They were relatives of that. One of the more interesting ones, I mentioned Woodbridge named a lot of streets after people he knew. Trumbull was named after his father-in-law, who was a fairly well-known poet on the East Coast, I think lived near Boston, and had come to Detroit to visit his daughter and died here in Detroit. And I think in memory of that, they named the street Trumbull after his father-in-law. So who didn't make it? A number of really important people. Aaron de Peyster was probably the best British administrator who ever served the city of Detroit, and arguably one of the better ones who ever served the city of Detroit of any era, and he's got nothing. Peter Audrain, also very, very important. He was the first American administrator to come to be in town when we became an American town. In fact, the very first board of trustees, 5 guys, only one of them was actually an American. 2 of them are Brits, John Askin being one of them, 2 of them were French. So Peter Audrain kind of became the clerk of town, one of the judges. He got a lot of important positions. He got nothing. Whitmore Knaggs, who had that strip farm that he held on to, got nothing, along with his neighbor DeGarmo Jones. Colonel Lernoux, who built that fort. There's 3 blocks named after Lernoux. James May, incredibly rich man here in Detroit, real humanitarian, got 3 blocks. John Askin, nothing in Detroit. Brush Street went to that farm. He has a short street named over in Sandwich after him. What's going on here? Sorry, this is a very sensitive piece of equipment. John Mullett. Now, you might remember Mullett Lake up north. He was one of the guys who did the surveying. He's got 1 block. And he's the guy that did all those maps that we were looking at earlier. Stevens T. Mason, our first governor, boy governor, 2 blocks. And Russell Alger, who 100 years ago was probably the biggest name in town because of his work in the Civil War. The GAR has just a half-mile name for him. So this is, some of these guys, despite being in the right spot, didn't get it. Yes, sir.
Anything on Palmer Park?
Thomas Palmer, there is a street called Palmer, and there, of course, Palmer Park is a huge part of that. His family had been in Detroit for 2 generations before that, so you'd almost think that they would have had something earlier on than Thomas Palmer, but I think Palmer donating that half square mile of property got him pretty famous at that point. So there's also the Merrill Palmer Fountain, which used to be right downtown and is now out in Palmer Park. If you haven't been by Palmer Park recently, they've been doing a beautiful job of fixing it up. In fact, they just pulled the old tennis courts out and they're putting new ones in. The Palmer Cabin is in really good shape. They closed the golf course and have taken at least the back 9 and turned it back into what could be arable farmland. Is really just meadow, natural meadow. They put in a water park. They're doing some wonderful stuff. So next time you're down between 6 and 7 Mile Road, stop and take a look at Palmer Park. So there you can see just above Mack Avenue, there's Orchestra Place, and you can see Martin Place. So that's really the only legitimate piece of property named after a woman because she's the one that donated it. So that's all I've got. I'm happy to answer questions. I appreciate y'all coming out on a tough night. Thank you. And I hope the storms have blown through. Yes, sir.
I don't know how familiar you are with out here, but 16 miles Jefferson and Metro Parkway goes up to Big Beaver, 16-mile road, head west, has one or two more names.
Corton, and then it changes to something else after that. Yeah.
Is it because several places start up and they give it their own name, and then each society gives it a name?
I would say it had to do with the township was naming them. Of course, Big Beaver was named after a community that actually was called Big Beaver there.
16 miles with D. So we didn't put
I would say that the farm lanes, the guys who were out here farming had to get their stuff downtown to market. So there were roads that would run down there, be it Livernois or Adams or Crooks. I don't know the history of all of those streets. And
I think when they updated it to more or less a 55-mile-an-hour road or something, that they would have picked one of the names.
I think that's kind of cool. I got to live in Ireland for a year, and there was a street in Cork, Western Road was the major name, but in about an 8-block area, it had 5 different names. And I just thought that was kind of quaint. So 16-mile road is our version of that, changing to reflect the area it's in. Big Beaver has to do with the neighborhood it's in. Corton, I'm sure, has to do with something, either a farmer or a mayor of that township or something that would have had that name put on there. So
here you have Woodward.
Yeah.
For about half a mile, and then it becomes Ludlow after about 55 degrees.
Oh, all right. Well, that's kind of weird. I wonder if it's the same Woodward. Because Woodward was it's not. Okay. Different family?
Yeah.
Okay. Woodward.
Roads were connected, which is why there's.
Okay. Woodward was heavily invested in Ypsilanti. He actually platted the town of Ypsilanti. That was his kind of fortune planted out there that he never got to realize. But that's interesting. There are Woodwards in a bunch of different places. I think it's a fairly common name. Yes, sir.
Telegraph Road is something.
Telegraph. That's and those we have all over the place. It was the telegraph coming out of Ohio, coming north and then making a turn. Now, at what point it started branching off? I was just reading this. The telegraph really came in the 40s, 1840s, early 50s, and they were private at that point. Private companies that would do it, and one would do one from Detroit to Chicago, and another would do one from Detroit to Ohio, and another would do one from Detroit to Pontiac. And they were just the main roads that you'd run those lines along. So at some point, I think, to his point, they just made the whole darn thing telegraph and kept it going. And maybe that was the line that came out of Ohio and went all the way up to Pontiac. So, but that's just a guess. I'm happy to say I'm just guessing. So, yes, sir.
Do you know about Deaconess Hospital?
No. No, what happened to it? I think it got torn down. Yeah, there were a couple down there. Blaine Hospital is now, I think, where the police department, the guys, the police that take care of the gambling in Detroit are based on.
We always think this is the beginning.
Well, Deaconess was, back then they had what they called laying-in hospitals, which were strictly for women to go and have babies or deal with other kind of problems like that. And I believe Deaconess was one of those kinds of hospitals. What's that?
I have the babies there.
There you go. There you go. They were specialized just for that purpose. Yep. Lady stuff was over there. So, yeah.
You didn't talk about the Outer Drive.
I didn't. That's a real morass. You want to talk about Outer Drive? It did surround the city. It in many cases took over other roads. Like over on the east side, it comes up Whittier from Mack Avenue, and then it turns onto Chandler Park. And I didn't even mention Zachariah Chandler, who is again one of our big politicians. Takes over Chandler Park Drive and then ends up somehow over heading back toward 8 Mile Road, and then comes across at 7 1/2 before it gets to be State Fair, and it just travels all over the city, really taking over. It was, taking over other streets. And ends up right back down at the foot of Jefferson on the other side on the river. So that's an interesting story, and not one I can tell all of. I don't know how they came up with that. I think it was an extension of Grand Boulevard. They liked the idea for Grand Boulevard. They wanted to do it on the outskirts, and I think most of it is Boulevard. So that they kind of designed streets to do that, to kind of open them up and create a park-like atmosphere. So it's a good idea. Yeah.
Do you know anything about Lasser Road?
It's a family name. Yep. In fact, the Lassers are still around. It's not Lasher. So that's what I grew up with. And somebody in the city's sign department got the S and the H mixed up on, a couple of miles worth of sign. And some of us grew up saying Lasher, and others grew up saying Lasser. And WDET actually chased down one of the Lasser families for that Born in the D or whatever they call that kind of question and answer thing. And Mr. Lasser came on and said, it's Lasser. And I grew up saying Saunders, and Mr. Sanders corrected me on that one too. So I'm always happy to be corrected when I'm wrong. So, well, thank you again for coming. Drive carefully. We can talk.